Hey y'all, welcome back to the Greg Brownderful Dimension. Today I'm going to be discussing something called awen. This is a Welsh word and a Welsh idea that is somewhat similar to the English word inspiration, but it's not exactly like inspiration. And I'm also going to talk about some Welsh folklore that I've been reading and how I relate the folklore to this idea of awen. And along the way, I'm hoping we can come to some insights that might be useful to us as artists and just as people living our lives. So what is awen? Well, it has to do with the divine breath, poetic inspiration, poetic genius. It's somewhat like these concepts we see in other philosophical and religious and literary traditions, like ruach in the Hebrew tradition, the spirit of the breath of life, atman in the Hindu tradition, pneuma in the classical Greek world. This notion of some kind of breath that gives life or that conjures, that brings the world into being. So it is kind of like that. I mean, in fact, awen is probably etymologically related to another Welsh word, awel, which means breeze. And inspiration, the English word, is also in this family, as I was mentioning before, has to do with breathing into. My sense is that when we talk about the spirit of the breath of life in, say, the book of Genesis or the Atman, as I was mentioning in Hindu tradition, these ideas are closely related to the origin stories of the universe. They have to do with the creative power of God or some God force. And they're not as literary as the word inspiration. When we talk about inspiration, or artistic, let's say, is the word inspiration. In the English language world, inspiration is used in all sorts of ways. It's a common word, but it's very, very commonly used in artistic context. For example, when I go out and give poetry readings, one of the commonest questions that I get in the Q&A after a reading is, what is your biggest inspiration, or from where do you take inspiration? Artistic inspiration is a commonly employed concept. When we talk about the spirit of the breath of life, or the atman, or the pneuma, the ruach, we're usually thinking more about a God creating the universe, something like that, or the nature of the universe, or the ground of being in the universe. Awen is both of these things. There is a real emphasis on awen as the force that brings the universe into being, or at least that brings beauty and sublimity into being. But it's closely associated with the poetic tradition in Wales. I think it's as literary / artistic in its implications and connotations as inspiration, but it's also got that mystical dimension that we experience in connection with a word like atman or ruach or pneuma, and so on. There are several of these across the world in different philosophical and mythological traditions. So the Welsh concept of awen, I even hesitate to call it a concept. It simply is. It is an elemental force or energy, and it's always moving. It is not a fixed thing. It's more about process and movement. If you read the Welsh druid Christopher Hughes in his book on Cadwyn, which is a Welsh goddess, there's a helpful discussion of awen. And in that book, he's very careful to say that Awen is about movement. It's about process, energy, flow. It's not like an object, like a fixed thing. And this will be important as we talk about some of the folklore that I've been studying lately. I want to talk about these magical beings that live in Wales called the Toth Tag. The Toth Tag are small people, magical beings. They can be like 1 foot tall or 2 feet tall. Sometimes they can be the same size as human beings, but rarely. In most accounts of folks' encounters with the Toth Tag are small. Toth Tag, this is a Welsh phrase. It translates as fair family. Tylwyth family, tag, fair. I will sometimes just say the tag, meaning the fair. That's not really a common way of talking about the Tylwyth Tag, but I find myself doing that sometimes. I think I just like small words. I always have been drawn to short words, so I might just say the tag. Okay, so the Tylwyth Tag have been encountered by the Welsh for a very long time, and there are wonderful stories about Welsh people's encounters with these beings. The tag are often very beautiful. Not always, not in every story, but in many stories they appear as beautiful beings. The other world in Welsh lore is called awen, and I think of the tag as living in awen and coming from awen. And actually, if you look at medieval Welsh poetry, you'll find that awen itself is generated or conjured or created in awen, the Welsh otherworld. And so the tag live in this place called awen, and they have various names across the country. If you travel across Wales and you talk to folks about the tag, you'll get different phrases. Tylwyth Tag is probably the commonest, but you'll also hear other phrases and words to refer to them. And one of these phrases is plant rhys ddofen. That word ddofen it refers to the deep, the depth, profundity, maybe the waters as well. And etymologically, there's a relationship between ddofen, which Welsh has an interesting linguistic feature called mutation. So words will change they'll be different in different contexts. And so sometimes you'll see doven and sometimes ddofen. That opening sound will change depending on context. But it's etymologically related to anoven. Anoven, you hear that oven part at the end, that's related etymologically to doven or ddofen. In one part of Wales, and here I'm thinking of that the bay there between like Aberdyfi and Aberdaron, that area there, that bay, those waters, that is the part of Wales we're talking about here in this next section. And that's where the plant rhys ddofen are said to live. And here's something fascinating about the lore here. It is said that the tag that live in this bay, they live on an island, and on this island, invisibility herbs grow. So the island has these herbs growing on it that will make the island invisible. And so you could be standing on the shore looking out across the bay, and the island is right there, and it's this magical, beautiful island of awen. It's full of awen. Enchantment, magic, beauty. But you can't see it. It will be obscured by mist because of the invisibility herbs. And there aren't many ways that human beings can see this island, this magical island, this island of awen. But there are certain ways, and so there are stories that you run into in the Welsh tradition about these certain very small patches of turf. I'm talking about a piece of ground, a piece of earth, a piece of turf, large enough for one person to stand on it, but not large enough for a lot of people to stand there. I'm talking about just a piece of ground beneath your feet. And it's said that if you're in a certain spot, those invisibility herbs grow on the mainland. And if you step onto that piece of ground where those invisibility herbs grow, you can look out and you can see the island of Awen on which the Tag live, the plant Rhys Ddofen, the children of Rhys the Deep. You can see where they live. You can see this magical land. But there are certain interesting features of this experience. So if you're listening to a certain storyteller, that person is likely to say, well, there's only one place where the invisibility herbs grow on the mainland. You have to be on the premises of St. David's Cathedral in Pembrokeshire. Or you have to be in this one little piece of ground in a little small village called Chemais. Or, it's this another storyteller might say, no, it's the only place is outside this other church. So when you're hearing the story, the person who's telling you is likely to say that there's only one spot where the invisibility herbs grow on the mainland, from which one can see the land of Awen, where the Tag live. But if you talk to a different storyteller, they'll say the same thing, except that patch of ground will be located somewhere else. So there's disagreement about where this particular patch of ground is from which we can see the land of the Tag. For me, this is related to an idea that I've come across in my study of the folklore, mythology, religion of Northwestern Europe. And here I'm drawing on a book called Romance of the Grail by Joseph Campbell that I highly recommend. He talks about how in the Holy Grail lore, it's often said that in order to find the Holy Grail, the knight who's seeking the Holy Grail needs to enter the forest in the darkest place, the darkest part of the forest, where there's no path, and there he will find his path. Because if you're the knight searching for the Grail, and you follow a path that already exists, that's somebody else's path. That won't work for you. It's not your path. And Campbell says that this is something special about the lore of Northwestern Europe. There's a real emphasis on finding one's own path. Whereas in some mystery traditions, the idea is that there is a path and a practice, like do these things, and it'll be very prescriptive, like go here or say this or do this thing or undertake this particular practice in order to achieve union with God or to deeply realize one's identity with God, whatever it is that you're trying to achieve or experience within that tradition. There will be a path, or maybe there will be 2 or 3 options. Okay, you need to do one of these 3 things. But in Northwestern Europe, according to Campbell, the idea is no, it's not about prescribing a path that we all are supposed to go down. It's about every single person finding their own path by entering the forest at the darkest place. Okay, and so the reason I'm bringing this up is that a similar idea is embedded in these Welsh stories, especially when you read them as a group, because one account will say there's this one spot from which you can see the magical isle, the magical island. But then you read this other story, and it's like, no, yeah, there's this one spot, but it's not the one that they told you about. It's this other spot. And then the next storyteller tells you about a different spot entirely. Perhaps the idea here is that one has to find that special place for oneself. That there is a special place, but you're going to have to find that for yourself. If you find that special patch of ground where the invisibility herbs are growing on the mainland, if you step onto that patch of ground, you can see the land of Awen. But you have to be there by yourself. There can't be two people on that patch of earth. Because if two people are standing there together, neither of them will be able to see the island. So you have to do this alone. And I think one thing that we might take from this is the idea that awen is not consensus reality. It's not the received reality, the quotidian workaday sense of things. It's an enchanted sense of things. It's special, and you don't experience it by just accepting some hand-me-down or some kind of like workaday consensus idea of what's real. You have to be on that special in that special place alone. And you have to find that special place alone. And then from there, you can see the island. You can experience Awen. An interesting take, I think, on this. Now, I will say that it's complicated because in the Welsh tradition, the poets whose voices are imbued with awen, they are extremely disciplined, and they will have spent years memorizing and reciting and internalizing the poetry of the great bards who came before them. So it's not about, oh, don't do any work, don't steep yourself in any traditions, just go out there by yourself and find and achieve the experience of awen, or wait for awen to offer itself. There's an idea that one disciplines oneself to internalize the tradition, to steep oneself in the tradition. And I would expand this beyond just artists. I think that if we want awen in our lives, that there's something to be said for the humility that it takes to open oneself to what others have seen and said and done, but also to remain open to finding one's own special place on the earth from which one can, and in which one can experience awen. So there's tension there between humility, receptivity, learning from others, and looking for one's own path, as Campbell says, in the darkest place of the forest. Another thing about these stories is that when human beings go into Anoven, into the land of Awen, they may think that they've been there for only a few minutes, or maybe a few days, or maybe a few years. It depends. From story to story, it changes. But when that human being then returns to the human world, they will find that way more time has passed than they thought, because one's relationship to time in Anoven, in the land of the Tag, is different from one's relationship to time in the human world. And generally speaking, what will happen in these stories is that a human being goes away with the Toth Tag and then thinks that they've only been gone a short time. They come back, and all the people they knew are now old or dead, and they themselves are old or dying. So there's some insight here about our relationship with time when we're in that place that is enchanted by awen. And as a poet, I've experienced this many times. When I'm really feeling the awen as a poet, it's crazy how time works. I mean, hours, days, years, it seems, sometimes can just fall away. But I think of this particularly with hours, like in a given day when I'm working. If I'm really feeling that, what the Welsh would call awen, 9 hours can pass and I didn't even think to eat or talk to anyone. I've just been in this other place, in Anofen. I've been in this magical place. And time it's not the same in that place as it is in the workaday, like if I'm at the office, taking meetings or something like that. Another thing I think about here is that when one is in that place of awen, one knows that one is in that place. No one has to tell you. Like when I was just talking about writing poetry. I mean, when that happens, there's no question in my mind that I'm where I need to be as a poet that day. And it makes me think about Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. I don't know if y'all know about this book, Letters to a Young Poet, by the poet Rilke, Rilke. If you don't know the book, I highly recommend it. I go back and read this book like every few years. It's like scripture to me. It's not that I necessarily agree with everything that he says, but that word ddofen or dofen in Welsh comes to mind because there's such depths of wisdom and insight in this book. And I just want to read a small section of it because it has to do with this idea of whether it has to do with confidence and knowing that one is in awen, in the place of awen, Anofen. Because you imagine if you were walking along in the Welsh countryside and you suddenly stepped onto a patch of earth where the invisibility herbs grow and you saw this magical land of the Toth Tag that you'd never seen before, no one has to tell you that something magical just happened to you. You would know. And there is an experience like this experience of awen that happens when one is making art. And Rilke speaks to this in this passage. In this book, Rilke is 27 years old. He's writing letters to, this is nonfiction. I mean, these were actual letters that the poet Rilke wrote to a younger poet who was 19, whose name was Capus. And Rilke says this. He's talking to Capus, and he says, you, Capus, you're asking me whether your verses are any good. And here I'm using a translation, by the way, by Stephen Mitchell. I want to give a shout out because I love this translation. It was the first one I ever read of this book, the Stephen Mitchell translation. So because it was my first one and because it's a very good translation, I've always enjoyed that version of it. I'm also a student of German, and I mean, you look at the original by Rilke, and nothing in English is going to capture exactly what he did, but I do think the Mitchell translation is quite good. And so, here we go. You ask whether your verses are any good. You ask me. You have asked others before this. You send them to magazines. You compare them with other poems, and you are upset when certain editors reject your work. Now, since you have said you want my advice, I beg you to stop doing that sort of thing. You are looking outside, and that is what you should most avoid right now. No one can advise or help you. No one. And I'm going to skip ahead a little bit now in this letter. Later, Rilke says this. If your everyday life seems poor, don't blame it. Blame yourself. Admit to yourself that you are not enough of a poet to call forth its riches. Because for the Creator, there is no poverty and no poor, indifferent place. And even if you found yourself in some prison, whose walls let in none of the world's sound, wouldn't you still have your childhood, that jewel beyond all price, that treasure house of memories? Turn your attention to it. Try to raise up the sunken feelings of this enormous past. Your personality will grow stronger. Your solitude will expand and become a place where you can live in the twilight, where the noise of other people passes by far in the distance. And if out of this turning within, out of this immersion in your own world, poems come, then you will not think of asking anyone whether they are good or not. Nor will you try to interest magazines in these works, for you will see them as your dear natural possession, a piece of your life, a voice from it. A work of art is good if it has arisen out of necessity. That is the only way one can judge it. Okay, so obviously this is a certain take on poetry, and I want to remind you what I said about the discipline of the Welsh bards, because you have to hold that intention with this idea of turning within. But I do think that what Rilke is saying here relates to something we were seeing in the Welsh stories, that if you step onto that, you're wandering in this forest, in the countryside, and you step onto that piece of earth that is steeped in, that on which grows the invisibility herbs of awen, and you see that city. You see that land, that magical island of the Toth Tag. Ain't nobody got to tell you that you've seen it. You know that. And I think this is something to believe in all our lives. I mean, one of the saddest things to me is to see someone who no longer believes it's possible to find that patch of earth where they can stand and see the enchanted city. And here's an interesting thing about the stories, these Welsh stories. This experience, although it seems localized, okay, I have to be on this patch of earth, it actually becomes portable. There's a story in which one man steps onto the piece of ground where he can see the land of the Toth Tag, and he realizes, oh, I can just take a tool and cut this turf where I'm standing and put it in my boat, and then I can stand on it in the boat and row out to the island where the Toth Tag live. And he actually does this, and it works. And I think one thing we can take from that is that when one finds that place of awen, it affects one's future. You can take something of this with you. And I think that's hopeful. And for me, it's inspiring. Another thing about the stories I've been reading about the land of the Toth Tag, there's something unpindownable about awen, about the magic of the Toth Tag. You can't capture it. It makes me think of what I was saying earlier about the Welsh language, the way it mutates. I mean, even the word for the deeps, for the deep, doven, changes depending on the sentence and can become ddofen. This happens all over Welsh, this mutation. There's something there that's close to the heart of Welsh mythological thought and feeling. The idea that the deepest reality is not fixed. And actually, in one story I read, it said that there was a man in a place in Wales called Conwy who heard the Toth Tag singing, and Welsh is the Welsh culture is so poetic. The whole Welsh heritage is steeped in poetry and song, and I think it's fitting that the Toth Tag who live in Anofen or live in the land of awen are themselves beautiful singers, and they're known to be. And this man in Conwy, he actually heard the tag singing, and he wrote down the I guess he used some sort of musical notation to write down the melody. But the folklorist I was reading on this, he said that this man in Conwy had written down this melody, but inquiry failed to find it. So when push came to shove, no one was able to produce this musical score. And I think here we have something, again, about this unpin-downable quality. It's like these melodies don't want to be scored. And this made me think of a moment in the Mabinogi, the great medieval Welsh collection of stories. When pigs were introduced into Welsh life, there's a moment in the fourth branch of the Mabinogi, and I'll read here from Sione Davis's wonderful translation. A fellow named Gwydion goes to another fellow named Math, and Gwydion wants to tell Math about these special creatures that have shown up in Wales. And he says, "Lord, I hear that some kind of creatures that have never been in this island before have arrived in the south." "What are they called?" said Math. "Hobai, Lord." "What sort of animals are they?" "Small animals whose flesh is better than beef. They are small, and their name varies. They are called moch now." It's a small moment, seemingly, but pigs in Celtic lore, not just in Welsh, but you'll see this in Irish lore also, for example. Pigs are from awen. They are magical animals. And here, Gwydion is talking to Math, and he says, "Here, there are these animals. Their flesh is better than beef. They've shown up in the south of Wales, and Math says, what are they called?" And he says, "Hobai," and then he says, "They're small, and their name varies. Actually, now they're called moch." So the name has changed just during the course of this brief conversation, and this in combination with the story about the kind of unscorable melody and the invisibility herbs, all of this that we've been talking about, it makes me think of lucid dreaming. I remember a few years ago I was studying lucid dreaming, trying to figure out how to do it. And one thing that you'll read if you're trying to do lucid dreaming is that if you're in a dream and you start to suspect that it's a dream, because while you're dreaming you think it's real, but sometimes during a dream we'll have that experience of suddenly thinking, wait a second, I think I'm dreaming. Okay, if you have that feeling, what you can do is try to find some text wherever you are. So like if you're in your bedroom in the dream and you have a notebook beside the bed, look at it, read the text, look away, then look back at the text, and it won't be the same. It will have changed. The text is unstable in a dream. And if you look at it, read it, look away from it, look back at it, it will have changed. And this makes me think of Richard Wilbur's wonderful poem, An Event. It's about blackbirds flying away in a field. And in the poem, Richard Wilbur is trying to come up with a metaphor that will kind of capture what these birds look like. And he comes up with some wonderful ones. He says the blackbirds look like a drunken fingerprint, for example. Or another metaphor he uses is as if a cast of grain leapt back to the hand because the birds are flying up. So he comes up with these wonderful images, but the thing is that every time he comes up with an image, by the time he has it, the birds are doing something else. And he says that they don't want to be caught in what he calls the nets and cages of my thought. This is something like what we're encountering here in the Mabinogi. Because even the name of the pigs changes by the time Gwydion has told Math about them. And you can't seem to write down the melody. And actually, in an Irish story called The Battle of Magmacrama, there's this mention of pigs, and it says that the pig. It mentions in this Irish literary work that the pigs are from the Irish, kind of the Irish equivalent of awen, the under. In this story, it's more like the underworld, and or maybe like a cave type locale. Regardless, it's a rough analogy to awen, and it says that the pigs don't want to be counted. If anybody tries to count them, or if anybody counts them, they'll move to a different territory. And then even if someone does count them, it won't be the same as someone else's tally. So two people could be standing there counting the pigs, and they'll never have the same tally. The pigs don't want to be counted. They don't want to be pinned down. They don't want to be enumerated or fixed. The text in a lucid dream is unstable. The names of the pigs is always, the names are always changing. You can't write down the melodies. You see what I mean? And sometimes I got the sense with lucid dreaming that I kind of lost interest in it, because ultimately it's about, in at least one type of lucid dreaming, it's sort of about control. Like, oh, if I realize I'm dreaming, can I fly in the dream? Can I do whatever I want? But the thing is, the conscious mind that wants to control things, and also that wants to take notes and bring some certain knowledge back to the waking world, is not really welcome in the dream, in awen. Because awen is not about fixing things. It's about experiencing a process, a magical process. I think there's a deep wisdom in that. I think that's about all I got for you today. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion of awen, the Toth Tag. I think there's something to this whole idea of awen, and I think that most of us are much more joyful and vividly alive and where we want to be in our lives when we are right there in the zone of awen.